Okay, so now I'm sharing my screen. Hopefully everybody can see my cover slide and not my Outlook calendar.
Yes, we do see
Quick
that.
sanity check
Yeah.
that is in fact what everybody sees, I guess. Okay, good to have everybody here. Not sure if accountability is a better category than goal setting, or if it's just more a matter of 10:30 is a better time slot than 8:30, but I guess I was kind of thinking I'd have about the same 35 or 40 I had at 8:30 in this one, but I doubled in size somehow. I'm not sure if it's topic or just time slot, but good to have you here. So this one is, kind of the basic accountability 101, you might say. I'll liken this one to the old Neil and Jay show, which has obviously been referenced in a lot of different sessions. There is no Neil and Jay show anymore. So this is kind of, what, we strung together kind of in lieu of that. So we had something instead of nothing for this. But the topics are similar, a little more CASA-centric because it's just me, myself, and I here. But we'll talk a little bit about programs updates. Some of these are updates from last year, not necessarily this year, but we'll look at some of the big program updates the last couple years. We'll bring back those goal setting targets. That was a big discussion in the presentation earlier this morning. The one this morning is where we really dig into goal setting and give those examples. We're not really doing that here, but we will list off what the official goal setting targets are in NOVA here, and a little bit about how you might do that. Most of this session is going to be looking at the different outcomes. We'll look at, with the focus, by key training issues. There are that big list of outcomes as represented by the Bubble Boy slides that I know a lot of you have been reviewing for years and years here now. So we have all of those outcomes that are there for CAEP. A lot of you have been to these sessions before where there's those 4 or 5 outcomes that seem to be the most confusing and generate the most questions above all of them. So we'll try to itemize out some of those outcomes that tend to confuse people the worst and generate the most questions. That's where we'll focus, and try to really itemize out a lot about the different outcomes. Added a few new slides with some newer questions we've been getting. And then in the spirit of just basic accountability, the last few minutes we'll cover the deliverables, timeline, and resources. We'll do a quick overview of the CAEP reports and TE. I got to say, if you want that, you missed it. The deep dive for CAEP reports really was the session I did at 8:30 when we did goal setting. But for this one, we will at least identify what some of those basic reports are and what the purpose of each one is and so forth. So I guess I'll just say, does that sound more or less to everybody what you were expecting to get yourselves into here this morning? Yes or no? I'll just say we gained participants since that spiel, miraculously enough. So I guess nobody's voting with their feet, to say no, I guess, right? All right, thank you for that. So let's go ahead and jump in. So this is really nothing new at all, but just kind of a review of the CAEP program structure. Every time I do these presentations, people usually say, hey, well, can you do something a little bit more basic so I can kind of get my feet firmly planted in the ground before you, barrage me with all these crazy details. So that's what this is really trying to do, is this is the basic CAEP program structure. We would say there are, historically, we've always said CAEP is comprised of 7 programs. Looking at it from a global state level perspective, we actually have 5. We have 3, what we call the basic programs. You can see that up top. We have ABE, ESL, and CTE. There are those 2 programs, adults with disabilities, parents supporting K-12 success, that really don't fit neatly into one of those 3 primary programs. So we say we've got the 3 primary programs and then the 2 other programs to comprise 5 total programs. Getting into CAEP land structure a little bit, where CAEP is a little bit different from the real world, you might say, is in CTE and ABE. So breaking down the three basic programs, start in the middle with ESL. ESL is ESL is ESL, no differences there. But over to the left with ABE, technically in CAEP land, ABE, high school diploma, and HSE are all one uniform program. In the real world, they're usually separate programs, but for CAEP reporting, that's all one program. Similarly, over there to the right with Career Tech Ed, you've got those four somewhat different, programs all locked into Career Tech Ed. That is CTE, short-term CTE, pre-apprenticeship and workforce preparation. This is just how the whole structure is organized, just FYI. Looking into CTE a little bit, because I think this is the one that probably confuses people the most, is we have all these different programs under CTE. We obviously have Career Tech Ed, in CAEP land, we have short-term CTE that applies to the college side. I don't think it applies anywhere else, but CAEP is run by the Chancellor's office, so it's part of the CAEP program. Then we have pre-apprenticeship and workforce prep. What we're doing here is just trying to distinguish, because a lot of times people think of CTE as kind of all the same, but just to get in the weeds a little bit and distinguish it, CTE is occupation specific and usually long-term. Short-term CTE is obviously occupation specific and short-term. Pre-apprenticeship is just a different delivery method. It's got the same goals as CTE and the same purpose of CTE, but it's a different delivery method, but it's also occupation specific and long-term. And all that as opposed to workforce preparation, which gets lopped into the same category, but that's short-term and not occupation specific. I'll just say over the years, there's been confusion about that. So that's getting in the weeds to distinguish those different workforce related programs. Also kind of reviewing some of the things, this is kind of recapping maybe the last year or so of the Neil and Jay show. We had those trainings back in 2019. Then COVID hit. We didn't really do this or really haven't done much of it since. So there were a lot of things we introduced as new in 2019. Gotta say, because of COVID and other things, kind of long since been forgotten, but just to kind of perk everybody's memory, just moving forward, some things about the program structure that were kind of big right before COVID. We used to have that program workforce reentry that we now call workforce preparation. So again, that's now for all learners. In the old days, if you've been at this, we used to have a lot of derived fields that I gotta say were very, very unwitting ideas that we fortunately got rid of. So we're not deriving anything now for workforce reentry. We're now just making it workforce preparation, and it serves all ages, all types of learners. We have that adult served with those three categories of learners. We covered that in, I gotta say, ridiculously gory detail in the early morning session when we were looking at goal setting. But again, by three categories, I mean those three buckets that people like Neil have been talking about for a long time. That is, you've got the learners with the 12 or more hours that are participants. You have those, adult served that have 1 to 11 hours, and you have those reportable individuals that may have 0 hours, but have some kind of information related to a program. So again, we've looked at those three buckets a lot. That is the 12 or more hours, the 1 to 11 and 0. And a lot of that goal setting now is oriented toward maximizing the number that have 12 or more hours, and trying to do that by moving people out of the 1 to 11 hours bucket and moving students out of that 0 hours bucket and moving them to where you have more participants and fewer adults served. We've also been looking at hours by program and multiple programs. I think there's a slide on that, so I'll talk about that here shortly. We're not recording hours of instruction for short-term services. Hours of instruction only apply to CAEP classes. This seems kind of obvious, but we're recording barriers to employment. That's required. And then we have that passage of exam, MSG. More on that. We'll recap that one a little bit when we get into outcomes, but that's been a big question asker. When we started this, we have that occupational skills gain, which is aligned to a federal outcome called skills progression. At the federal level, a couple years ago, they changed the name of the federal outcome from skills progression to passage of an exam. It's the same outcome, but you've got to have some kind of exam involved in order to record the outcome. So I'll get into that here in a few minutes. Okay, okay. Okay, so sanity check here. I went through a big list. I'm worried I'm losing people already. So just because I have that little bug in the back of my head saying, gee, you're losing people, you're just talking about nonsense already. Everybody hanging in there. Let's just sanity check me just because my voice is telling me I better. Okay, thank you. Keep going. All right, so I'll try to squelch that little voice next time. But yeah, my little voice was really sabotaging me and saying, yeah, nobody knows what you're talking about. Everybody's already looking at their exit strategy for this one. That's what my voice was telling me. So let me just double check. All right. So getting into that laundry list and giving a little detail here, hours by program. So that was a big issue a couple years ago. I'm not quite sure where this is going from a statewide point of view, but I know locally a lot of you at different consortia are worried about how you're recording hours. You're looking to maximize hours. And a lot of you are looking at that from an instructional program point of view. So that CAEP hours by program report records that for you. The big issue has come up is if you have learners that are in more than one program, the CAEP summary is duplicated across program, unduplicated within program. So we already are going out of our way to record all program enrollments. We're not unduplicating it like we do for WIOA. So what we do is we go out of our way to show enrollment in both programs and then just divide the hours equally. So if you have a student, we'll use an obvious example, a student who's in ESL and also in CTE. If you do nothing, that's okay, but just know if you do nothing, the default behavior is the TE report will assume it's 50-50 and just divide those hours equally. If you happen to know that it really should be 70% ESL or 30% career tech ed or whatever, that's fine, but just know then you need to go out of your way to create two separate classes, make sure all the ESL hours go into the ESL class and all the CTE hours go into the CTE class. In my example, if you want to bunch it all into one class, that's fine, but the default behavior will always be 50-50. Okay, more on hours. This was the big issue in summer of 2017 or spring of 2019. There were a lot of questions going on for about a year about whether we should count service hours as part of instructional hours. For about a year, when you went to the Neil and Jay show, we would waffle on that question because we really didn't have an official answer. So there was about a year of waffling, and after about a year of waffling, the final answer is CAEP will not track service hours. It's still requiring you to track those provision of short-term services. So yes, you should include those students, but no, you should not record any hours just to services. The hours are just for those classes in the CAEP instructional programs. So again, yeah, when you're doing NOVA reporting, when you're looking at that CAEP hours by program report in TE, it should only be including those hours from CAEP classes, not hours from short-term services. Okay, here's that big thing that's new this year with the goals is, again, we've got adult serve. So to be clear, when we use adult serve, that actually includes everybody, but then we've got those individual, these are the three buckets. We have the service only students, that is students that make the map and show up as reportable individuals on the CAEP summary, but who have 0 hours of instruction. Usually that's service only students. Sometimes that could be data cleanup that needs to happen, but we'll call them service-only students. Then the second bucket are students that have received instruction, but they have not received the 12 or more hours. And then the third bucket, that's what we're looking for. That is, we're looking to maximize the number of participants. That's the federal term for the students that have the 12 or more hours, who also have all those required demographics. That is, they've met all of those requirements to be an official CAEP, enrollee, an official CAEP participant. Okay, we talked about this report at length in the first hour. So for a couple of you, this might be review, but these are the newest reports in TE. One is the CAEP enrollees by hours. The other is the CAEP service enrollees by hours. The purpose of these two reports is really exactly the same. They're just displaying the data in different ways. The one you probably want to review first is the one on the screen now, the enrollees by hours. What this is doing is basically showing those three areas on the CAEP summary, those three areas in which students can qualify on the CAEP summary. And then for the outcomes section and the services section, breaking it down into those three buckets we just described. That is, of those that qualify for outcomes, how many have 12 or more, how many have 1 to 11, how many have 0. Of those that get dumped into the services section, how many have 12 or more hours, how many have 1 to 11, how many have 0. So you can usually, you're going to be looking at the services for section for this usually, but you can look at these different sections. So in this example, we have 855 ESL learners that show up in that services section. You can see 609 of them actually have 12 hours. There's some other issue that's keeping them from getting into the outcomes section. So we've got, those, we can look at those 609. We can compare that to the 98 and 148. Again, to the maximum extent possible, we're trying to move people out of that column H and I and getting them into F and G, that is getting more with 12 or more hours to become a participant. As we look at that, I'll just say the service enrollees breaks it down to the service categories. So if we see we have a lot of services only that might have 1 to 11 or 0, we can go ahead and look at those service categories and drill down and try to figure out where those students are, as again, a way to troubleshoot and try to bring more into the 12 hours bucket. Okay, moving on to the next big issue. This is that passage of an exam issue. So because I just got through playing musical screens, I'm going to be a little bit of an annoying stickler on sanity checks because I'm talking about way too many things at once. Everybody following me as I just casually move out of that really big topic and casually move into another kind of confusing topic called passage of an exam. Okay, even though I'm just cavalierly moving from one complicated topic to the next, that's your story and you're sticking to it. You're following me, no problem. All right. So passage of an exam, we brought this up again. This is another one from a couple years ago. This used to be called skills progression at the federal level. So anyway, at the federal level, we have those 5 measurable skill gains or 5 MSGs. One of them under WIO has been called skills progression. A couple years ago, the feds changed the name of skills progression to passage of an exam. Stepping out for a minute, the skills progression was always intended to be one more for Title I, not us in Title II. That is, it's a measurable skill gain for workforce programs. When we started CAEP 5 or 6 years ago, we looked at those WIOA 1 outcomes as a good way to align and use it for our CTE outcomes in CAEP. So those CTE related outcomes, one is called occupational skills gain, the other is called workforce prep milestone, were based on that federal skills progression MSG for WIOA 1 programs. We thought it was the closest approximation to WIOA that we could use to report those CTE gains. So anyway, a couple years ago, the feds changed it to passage of an exam. The purpose didn't change at all. The way that you measure this outcome really didn't change at all, except for from this point forward, in order for those workforce clients to get the gain, they need to pass some kind of an exam. That specific exam is pretty loose, but what we decided to do in CAEP land is pass on the love for our CAEP outcomes. So now whenever you record that occupational skills gain, there ought to be some kind of exam that they pass. You can see the examples, below. You can decide what that exam is. Sometimes you already have an exam that they pass when they move on from one semester to the next. Some of you might say, hey, it's CTE, so doing skills checks makes a lot more sense than written exams. If so, that's fine. If you want to do CASAS testing, again, that's not required for this, but if you want to use CASAS testing as the passage of an exam, that's also fine. Just earning a diploma. So do you mean earning a high school diploma or something else? I assume you mean high school diploma. If so, no, that's not an occupational skills gain. But as we move along, you'll see high school diploma is its own outcome. So no, high school diploma does not count as an occupational skills gain because we already count high school diploma as an official CAEP outcome. So we kind of go out of our way to count it as a high school diploma and not an occupational skills gain because, hey, we're tracking high school diplomas. GED is an outcome, a section of a GED is not. I'll just say that's never really been aligned. You're in a big club of people that have brought that up in the past, but at least as of now, when they pass the entire GED, yes, that absolutely is an official CAEP outcome, but the official CAEP outcome is only for passing the entire GED, not one of those subsections. Good questions. Anything else like that? Okay, so we'll move along. These are good questions. These make me feel better that you're asking smart questions. So thank you for making me feel better. So moving along here, these are our official CAEP goal setting and targets. We're just pretty much dumping all this information, in one fell swoop on you. So here's our goal setting and targets. So it's broken down into 3 basic categories. We've got our mandatory consortium level metrics, our mandatory member metrics, and then the larger list of optional member level metrics. I'll get more into that later, but the short answer, Karen, is no, not the CPR exam. There are things that they could do as a CNA that would be occupational skills gain, but I would say CPR exam, that's way too short. Potentially you could count CPR as a workforce prep milestone, but so if you're marking it as that, I think that's a small problem, not a big one. But if you're asking me, I would say no, CPR is way too little for occupational skills gain. Occupational skills gain is more like completing a semester worth of work, not just a 2 or 3 hour course like CPR. Okay, I see what you're saying, Kim, but for now, sorry, it's not. So in any case, let's move on. So here are our mandatory consortium level metrics. So the mandatory at the consortium level, we've got those 4 barriers, and I should have looked it up knowing that I was going to present it again, but I think it's low literacy. It's low literacy, long-term unemployed, low income, and I think English literacy. I think those are the 4 that we're looking for. Maybe somebody's gonna jump in and correct me on those. I always forget that 4th one, but anyway, there's 4 barriers that are presented to you in NOVA. You don't really need to get that complicated for it with the mandatory metric. All the mandatory metric is doing is giving you an item count, and you're basically monitoring your item count of those 4 barriers and showing that you're doing due diligence to actively serve those barriers. A stated priority statewide for CAEP is that we're actively going out of our way to serve students who have barriers to employment, a big topic of this summit has been equity. The way one real good way we would say we show that in our data is by reporting on barriers to employment and dutifully showing that we're serving students that have all those barriers. So the mandatory metric is to show that we're doing exactly that. And then we've just got that bottom line head count of reportable individuals. That's all three buckets that we were talking about, where we're just looking to have the biggest number possible in terms of overall number of reportable individuals by consortium. Okay, then at the member level, there's that little metric that Neil's talked about for a year longer now, where he's looked at the amount that each agency is funded, looked at the total number of adults served at each agency, and kind of given a dollar amount per learner. I believe that was programmed into Nova, so everybody is going to look at how much money by student, they're putting in. That's a mandatory metric. And then here's that moving from one bucket to another that we talked about, the number of enrolled adults that become participants. So that is how many 1 to 11s and how many 0 hours are moving into that 12 or more hours bucket. That's the mandatory metric. That's also why I'm making such a big stinking deal about those 2 new TE reports. Okay, and then here's optional metrics covering all sorts of areas. The more I'm hearing about this, the more and more flexible it is. I think at the beginning, there was an interest to kind of pin your nose to using that number that's in Launchboard and using only that one specific metric. As it's morphed along, I think the flexibility, much to everybody's relief, is increased a lot, that you can use those numbers in Launchboard. You can use numbers from TE reports. You can use numbers from COMIS reports. You can use numbers from other systems you might be using at your agency. But bottom line is you're documenting the number of diplomas, HSE, maybe you're looking at post-secondary, looking at pre-post gains, overall or by specific program, looking at the transition to CTE, transition into 4 credit. You can look at, your follow-up data 2 quarters after exit for employment, look at earnings, or you can look at that immigrant integration milestone. That is that I3 outcome you get by students passing, EL Civics COAPs. So again, a lot of flexibility in the way you look at this, but you're going to be required to select optional metrics that address these specific areas. So I think the long story short is, when we're looking at categories for reporting, you really need to use these areas that relate to our official outcomes, secondary, post-secondary, employment, literacy gains, and so on. But when you get to specific data systems, or whether you want to measure it by agency or by program, or when you're looking at specific reports that you might use to measure it, you've got some flexibility as far as that's concerned. Okay, so we're in a transition here. We're kind of getting into more rudimentary Neil and Jay show stuff from this point forward. So let's do another sanity check. Does that goal setting information make sense? Does all of this stuff that we've been talking about make sense so far? Sorry, a convenient time to do a sanity check yet again. Okay, that's your story and you're sticking it to it. YEP. Okay, so anyway, this slide, if you've been a career follower of this stuff, this slide looks familiar. This is the slide that we put up when we first started doing AB 86 accountability, not even ABG, I don't think. I think we had this slide up when it was still AB 86. But this is the slide we were showing to kind of give an overview of those outcomes. And specifically, we used this slide to show that we didn't just make it up, that first off, we were basing the outcomes on the AB 104 legislation specifically passed by the California state legislature. Number 2, we also wanted to show that the state legislature wasn't making it up either. The state legislature approved these as the official outcomes based on their understanding that these outcomes ensured that we were aligning our outcomes to the federal WIOA system. Part of the whole ABG and prior to that AB 86 framework is we would have a statewide accountability system aligned to the federal WIOA system. In that federal WIOA system, we have what are called performance indicators and measurable skill gains. Performance indicators, I like to say, are outcomes that you can hang your hat on. You got a job, you got a pay raise, you got your GED, whatever. That is, you have an outcome that you can really measure by completing something or getting a piece of paper. But we also have those outcomes called measurable skill gains that suggest improvement without necessarily finishing anything. So the issue there is everybody agrees things like diploma and job and wage increase are all really, really good outcomes to achieve. But if we rely solely on performance indicators, a lot of times we're setting our students up for failure because, yeah, some students get jobs and some students complete their diploma, but a lot of students out there maybe haven't finished it to where they've gotten the job or finished their diploma yet. But we know that those students nonetheless are doing a really, 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 really good job. For that, the feds have MSGs or measurable skill gains. That is a way to measure progress, even though the student hasn't gotten the job or finished the diploma or GED yet. The obvious example of that is CASAS pre-post testing, where we might be able to show a lot of students that we know have not yet gotten a job. We know they haven't yet passed the GED, but we know they've done a great job on their CASAS pre-post. So we report those measurable skill gains so we can show that even though our students haven't finished their final outcome yet, that they've still done a great job because we can show these gains on CASAS testing as a means to prove it. Like we talked about for things like occupational skills gain, we've retrofitted some of these other federal measurable skills gains so we can kind of apply that same concept to ASE programs and to CTE programs and so on. When you combine those performance indicators and measurable skill gains in unison, that basically almost word for word equates to the 4 areas of AB 104 that the California legislature passed 6 or 7 years ago that comprise our mandatory areas for CAEP reporting. Okay, so springing on to that, what we did then is looked at these key areas. We aligned some outcomes to the 6 areas of AB 104. I know a lot of you have probably seen this slide way too many times, but again, it's the 4 areas of CAEP reporting: literacy gains, secondary, post-secondary, employment, wages, and transition. So those are the 6 areas, and you can see each of those areas has a handful of outcomes that fall into one of those 6 categories. So anyway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of bird walk through some of these areas, focusing mostly on the literacy gains and post-secondary, but some of these, like get a job, get a high school diploma, don't need a lot of explanation, but others, like especially some of these non-testing literacy gains and some in post-secondary do. So again, we're going to pick out some that are the biggest problems. So I'll start with this one. This is on the ASE side, and this one directly relates to federal reporting, that generally when we report measurable skill gains for our NRS tables, we're looking at those CASAS pre-post test gains. But when WIOA started, there's an alternative you can use for federal reporting, specifically for students in high school diploma, where they can report gains through high school credits instead of through pre and post tests. So the long story short is, for high school diploma students that start at the 9th or 10th grade level and finish at the 11th or 12th grade level through high school credits, that's a way in which they can make a gain. This screenshot shows kind of the workaround we have in TE, where in TE you record this by using the TE self-reported level as demonstrated on the screenshot, and the basic TE directions are shown in that little text box where we have a place in TE to record credits, but every district has a different number. So in order to record this, we use that self-reported level shown here. But one, just to give you the basic info, if you've got those high school diploma students that are making progress, that is an alternative way to show an MSG. Okay, looking at some other literacy gains for CTE, here are the ones that probably generate questions the most over the last few years. That is those CTE related literacy gains. Again, we have one called occupational skills gain, another called workforce prep milestone. Before I jump in, I'll say if you've got this confused, if you've been reporting this, backwards, or maybe you use slightly different criteria, I'll go out of my way to say that's a very small problem, because at the end of the day, it all gets kind of lopped up the same way in the CAEP summary. But for most of you, that doesn't sit very well. You want to make sure you have a very concrete distinction. So this is the concrete distinction I like to provide here, is occupational skills gain suggests accomplishment of a portion of a longer term program, whereas workforce prep milestone suggests full completion of something shorter term. So our example for occupational skills gain, it says welding, but I'll use CNA because somebody brought up CNA in a question earlier. So if you just subtract welding and put CNA, I would say the same example applies. So let's just say you've got a CNA program that's 5 semesters or 5 modules long. We'll just say the CNA student enrolls in the first semester, does a great job. She finishes that first semester and you did a little skills check, hey, she's able to do it's the first module, so it's all the basic stuff. She shows that she can check blood pressure and temperature really well. So she does that little skills check. That's the passage of an exam. So she passes that with flying colors and finishes the first module and moves into module number 2. That would be an example of occupational skills gain. Well, it's CTE is what we're calling it, just because usually these outcomes on the slide apply to your CTE programs. It's not required that it be just for students in CTE. It can be earned by students in other programs, but we call it CTE related outcomes because the assumption is these are usually going to apply to students in CTE. I think that's your question. If it's some other question, then sorry, I don't understand your question. Okay, I'll assume that that's the question you're asking. So in any case, on the other hand, I think to the question, Karen, your question was, what if they pass a CPR course? I would say that's a good example for workforce prep milestone, but not really enough to be a good example for occupational skills gain. But if you fully complete something shorter term, so in your example, I'm assuming you're kind of saying, yeah, you need to enroll in CNA, you need to complete these 5 modules. There is a CPR course that we're requiring CNAs to do, but we're having you do that separate from the regular instruction or whatever. So yeah, you could use that as a potential workforce milestone. If they complete it, that would be an example of full completion of something shorter term. You can see the example on the slide is not for CNAs, but it's kind of similar. So hopefully that answers the question and clarifies these 2 outcomes. Right, yeah, no. Occupational, hold that thought, another no. Occupational skills gain would be more like the example I'm putting on the slide where they did, if they're only doing CPR, I would say that's way less than a full module. So it would be more like, hey, they passed the full module, they completed the CAT class, and they completed a written test that shows they understand everything in that first module, not just CPR. The CNA exam would actually be a post-secondary outcome. That's the next slide. So I'm showing an old slide just to kind of give you what I'm comparing it to. But again, we've got post-secondary outcomes, and we've got literacy gains. The post-secondary, I'll relate here to what we might call performance indicators. That is, they get the final outcome. The occupational skills gain workforce prep is more the measurable skill gains. That is, they're making progress, but they haven't really finished yet. That post-secondary outcome would kind of suggest they finished something. So again, we'll use that same CNA example where they do CPR, where they complete something shorter term, or they finish module 1 of 5, that is partial completion of something longer term. Keeping with that same example is once that CNA student passes module 5 out of 5, and as you say, actually gets that CNA certification, that's when it rises out of this literacy gain and moves into rises to the level of post-secondary. So when they actually get their CNA certificate, you should be marking one of these post-secondary outcomes, not just one of the literacy gains. When they get the CNA certificate, that's the post-secondary kind of final outcome we're looking for, where congratulations, they're now certified to be a CNA officially in the state of California. Good questions. You kind of guided me along. I'll just say, hopefully those questions Karen asked were helpful to everybody. I'll say it was helpful to me because you gave me something concrete to talk about instead of all this esoteric stuff on the slide. So I'll just stop for a moment. Does everybody feel like they've got a handle now on workforce prep milestone versus occupational skills gain, and in turn, these two CTE literacy gains versus these higher level post-secondary outcomes? Right, hold that thought, Iris. That's a good question. The next few slides kind of address that question, I believe. So starting here, and this is actually straight from the Octane website, I've got to say, so I feel pretty good about this chart. The titles up at the top don't really do much for me, but I really did kind of like this chart because it kind of put things into four neat and tidy categories. What I did is I drew that little line here. You see that dotted line? That was my work to show that what the feds are calling a certificate to the left kind of doesn't really quite cut the mustard. What they're calling certification, degree, or license over to the right, I would say does. But we've been talking a lot about how, when we're looking at things like IET, ILCE on, WIOA Title II reporting, as well as looking at these different CAEP outcomes for post-secondary and for literacy gains, everybody has had a devil of a time kind of distinguishing what are higher level outcomes versus what are not higher level outcomes. So for my 2 cents, what the feds are calling certificates are good outcomes, but they're definitely examples that do not qualify. These are definitely not post-secondary outcomes. They're not occupational skills gains, and they're not certificated programs that qualify for workforce training, for integrated education and training, for WIOA 2 reporting either. They're just short-term things like food handler, like CPR, like OSHA Serve Safe, and all that kind of stuff. That would be what's demonstrated in that left-hand column. On the other hand, in the right-hand column are the outcomes that actually qualify as quote unquote post-secondary outcomes. One big source of confusion I'll point out by that column, that middle column called degree, where when we use the word post-secondary, one confusing thing about it at the federal level is post-secondary includes those quote unquote academic related outcomes for post-secondary. It also includes those CTE occupational outcomes for post-secondary. They're two rather, dissimilar types of outcomes are grouped together in the same category. So in certification, that means they get their certified welder, or technician, sort of stuff. They're under license. There's the RN, CNA, cosmetology, all that. So sometimes it's a certificate, sometimes it's a license, but all of those CTE related occupational certificates all count. At the same time, the associates, the bachelor's, advanced degrees also all count. That's why I say it's kind of two dissimilar types of outcomes all bunched together. But back to this chart, what I think is convenient here is these right-hand columns all give you some tangible examples of things that rise to the level of post-secondary versus these things over to the left that do not rise to that level. Okay, and so here we're digging deep. Here's kind of some Pete and repeats of slides I've used before that give you the same information, but it's not that nifty little neat and tidy chart like I just showed you. And it's state level information, not from the almighty feds like that chart. But anyway, here's examples again, a lot like the chart I just showed you, but just in bullet format. You know, again, all of those different, you know, higher institution degrees, associates, bachelor's, higher ed. Again, occupational licensure, you know, CNA is an example there. Occupational certification like automotive, you know, registered apprenticeships. If you're in the CTE system in California, obviously that works. And then the big one that we've talked about a lot in IET, and we brought it up at CAEP a little bit as well, is any recognized program in your local employment trainer provider list. We've brought that up a lot with IET, where maybe you've got something, I'll bring this back, like maybe it really is a program that really looks and acts a lot more like something in that left-hand column here. That is something that really, if you use all the, you know, use all the benchmarks, it really looks like it fails to rise to this level rather than it passes. But you know, it's a really good program, and you know students are getting jobs at it, probably way more jobs at it than any of these over to the right that are officially sanctioned. So what we've said, if you know things like that, what you really need to do is work with your local WIOA Title I and get it on the official WIOA, WIOA 1 employment training provider list. Sorry, I'm getting some excessive noise here. So I'm closing my door and trying to make that go away. So if my voice is echoey, it's because I'm walking around trying to do some things here. Anyway, work with your Title I, get on your local ETPL. Bottom line is, if the program's on the ETPL, then that means by definition, it qualifies an officially certification program, because if it's on the ETPL, that means locally in your local region, everybody has gotten together and agreed that your program addresses an important need in your local area, and thereby locally you're recognizing it as something that you know contributes to job attainment in your local region. So that was a big mouthful, and I said some of it walking around and standing up. So for all of those poor presentation reasons, is everybody hanging in there? Well, it depends. Usually security guard license, I've got to say, is something shorter term. So there's a little bit, how long is that security guard program? If you're saying, hey, it's something that's, okay, well, then it's probably going to be fine. What I would say, if you have a security guard program, you'll want to look through and make sure, do they actually get some official license or certification when they finish that program? Yes, they do. So as long as you have that documented, then the short answer is yes, that would be, and again, and that what you're bringing up, Iris, I guess, is why some of this a lot of times seems kind of loosey-goosey, is there are big card carrying programs like automotive and CNA that everybody does that's been pretty standardized. Things like you're saying with security guard, probably a lot less standardized, so a lot harder to determine. I'll just say what you need to do first off is look, has there already been something kind of institutional put in place where there's an official certified license for that, yes or no? If yes, just plug it in and insist that they get that certified license. If so, then go ahead and record them as occupational certificate or occupational license. I'll just say I've worked with a lot of you over the last 4 years or so, though, where the answer is no. If the answer is no, then you really kind of need to do a little more legwork. The legwork I would recommend is working with your WIOA 1 and getting that program on your local ETPL. And usually if you can prove that your local program contributes to students getting jobs, you know, my understanding is usually your Title I really wants to work with you because they're eager to have more programs that contribute to everybody getting jobs, obviously. So I'll stop right here, everybody, but especially Iris and especially Karen. Is everybody hanging in there with all this information? Okay, there we go. Late returns, but everybody's looking positive. Good. Okay, so here's some positive examples. Here's some, you know, maybe, you know, these are all great things, but just to show these are the sort of things, you know, kind of that left-hand column of the chart from a couple slides ago, things that are wonderful things for students to do, but it does not, it's not long enough. It's just not, doesn't quite cut the mustard for post-secondary. Things like health and safety courses, Microsoft Office training, there's Surf Safe and CPR showing up again. Those real short-term things are good to do, but they're not necessarily official post-secondary credentials. Okay, and then back to your question, Iris. Yeah, it could be a workforce prep milestone, yes. The WSCS certification, I would say, would be a good one to use for that passage of an exam. So if you're doing CASAS WSCS, then yeah, that potentially would be more of like a workforce prep milestone, I think. But what the WSCS would do is that would be a good way to cover that passage of an exam and be able to show, yeah, we're running people through CNA courses and through welding courses and automotive courses and so on. And we're using WSCS as a more foolproof way to officially certify that these students really are ready for the world of work. And so that, I would say, would be kind of the ideal model agency way to cover that passage of an exam. Does that make sense, Iris? To your question, Chris, yeah, it could be workforce prep. I'll just say the MS Office usually is a standalone. You know, yeah, that's an example of something that doesn't cut the mustard. I'll just say that's an example of something where I know some agencies have tried to work and put it on the ETPL. You know, when we first started IET, you know, I remember lots of contentious meetings where I had to point out that Microsoft Office just doesn't do it. Some agencies really didn't like that feedback. The feedback I would give is, hey, if you know it's working, if you know that really leads to business skills or tech skills, whatever, and you can prove that students are getting jobs and so forth, then work with your Title I, put it on the ETPL. That's always my way of saying, if you feel like it's a lot better than Yahoos like me say it is, get it on the ETPL, and then you can, by definition, count it as a post-secondary credential. Right, you could also use MS Office as some of those other outcomes on the update record. Good point, Tanush. Okay, so we went through this. So again, back to the question, a couple of those questions from Iris of ones that are not really clear cut one way or the other. This is from California EDD. I really like this slide, you know, kind of, hey, this is sort of their criteria, where if you're trying to say if it looks like a duck and it acts like a duck sort of stuff, these are some criteria you can use for the looks like a duck sort of, you know, criteria. Is it accessible? It should be affordable. You know, if it's a good post-secondary credential, it's readily available at multiple places, multiple times for multiple students. It should be transparent. The costs and prerequisites are clear. The student knows going in what skills, what knowledge they're going to acquire. Stackable is a really big one. Can you stack it up? So back to your Microsoft Office questions, Chris and Tanush. This is a good way to evaluate whether you've got Microsoft Office in a good way or a not so good way. That is, if you've just got that like 10-hour course on Excel in a vacuum and that's all you're doing, and you're trying to count that as post-secondary, sorry, that's a big time failure in my opinion. But if you take that same 10-hour Excel course and stack it up with a Word course and maybe a database management course with some secretarial skills courses and some soft skills training and some business skills training, and that 10-hour course on Excel is just one of 8 or 10 different things that you stack together into something that you're calling post-secondary. Again, I would say that stackable batch of manageable chunks is going to look a lot better than that small little course by itself. Portable is another good way to look at it, where, hey, once you start stacking them together, could you put those together and have that be transferable? Or did you just do some crazy math where, yeah, you made them stackable, but if you move them anywhere other than your school, it's going to be a gigantic ball of confusion. Again, it should be portable where you've got it to where if they went to another college or another adult school, they would look at it and say, yeah, we understand this. We do something kind of similar here. We can kind of transfer it. And by doing this at our school, it's kind of the same thing as doing what you've set up at your own school. And then meaningful, is it something that gets jobs? Does it link to other degree programs or other workforce programs and so on? Right, if it's certified by the state, then obviously it's a post-secondary outcome. I'll just say if you've got official state certification and licensing, then you should be pretty good to go for that. You just need to show that you've received that certification and that you've got something that you can really hang your hat on. And then I would cross-check it against this list I just showed you. If you feel like all of these positive attributes apply, that's probably a good sanity check that you're on the right track at your agency. I'll just say, hopefully we're talking to, okay, thank you, Agnes. Okay, and then here's a slide. This is one we talked about a long time ago. It's still somewhat relevant, but just another way to kind of measure this up is there's that ETPL appearing on top. Again, if you've worked with your local Title I, you've made your pitch to say, yeah, this is a meaningful program. Yes, this is one in which students are definitely getting jobs. That's the foolproof way. If you're looking at time, that's been a big issue that everybody really, really wants. I've got to say, a lot of this kind of annoyingly kind of goes out of its way to avoid concrete numbers of hours. Everybody that provides these services to students wants the state to get more toward concrete numbers of hours at the state level. They're very, very, very resistive to getting into set numbers of hours. I'll just say, because everybody that provides this would really wishes the state would get more into requiring hours instead of less. I'll use the 48 hours that the college system uses. It's the only system that really attaches a number to it, in my opinion. If you're doing Perkins, that's another good way to look at it. Perkins generally is stricter than WIOA on a lot of these type of rules. So generally speaking, if it passes all those rules that the feds require for Perkins, that's a good sign that you're on the right track. If you're getting Pell Grants or Title IV student aid, that's even stricter than Perkins is. So if it meets all those high bar requirement, that's another really good sign that you're on the right track. Okay, so I really do feel like doing a deeper dive into post-secondary. I'm officially sticking a feather in that one and saying that was a good idea to do a deep dive into that. These questions have been awesome here. I'll have to have Anthony save them so I can use them as examples in future trainings. That said, just because this has been, in my opinion, a really good part of this training, I'm very encouraged by your questions, I gotta say. That said, everybody feels pretty good about this and we're ready to start talking about some of these other categories now. Okay, thank you, Iris. Okay, I have others jumping in. Okay, great. So the next area is transition. The detailed outcomes for transition, really not a big issue, but just the exact student X's and O's over the last few years, more the issue there. So again, when we're recording a transition outcome, we're basically starting at one of these blue boxes on the left-hand side, and we're finishing in one of these 3 red boxes on the right-hand side. So the 2 starting points for a CAEP transition outcome either needs to be in K-12 adult education, ABE, ASE, or ESL, or non-credit community college, ABE, ASE, or ESL. If they transition to either K-12 adult ed CTE or community college CTE, that's an official transition to CTE. If they start at either one of these starting points and finish in 4 credit community college, I'll say again, it must be 4 credit, not non-credit. If it's from adult ed to non-credit, that's more like a non or a lateral transition, not a full transition. But if you start in adult ed or non-credit and you move into 4 credit, that's considered the transition to college, right? I would say, yeah, you're just giving one example, Cindy, but based on the way you describe it, yes, that looks like a transition to college example that you're giving. I don't know if you're making a statement or asking a question, Cindy, but I'll just say, yeah, that looks about right to me. Okay, there we go. Great. All right. So it looks like we're okay here. So just summarizing it, this is the infamous bubble boy slide. We've been talking about this for 5 years now. I'll just point out, we brought this up in the last TE meeting, beginning of October. We did change, I mean, it's mostly the same, but we did add a couple bubbles to the bubble boy slides. You can see down here, these 2 under transcript or report card are now considered post-secondary outcomes. We aligned these for some IET outcomes on the NRS Fed tables. So we're recognizing it in California for our Fed tables. So it made a lot of sense to just pass that love along for CAEP reporting like we already initiated for NRS. Okay, so moving along, this is the same slide. This first one is just aligning all of these outcomes to the update record bubbles. If you're doing scanning, this is the exact same information, but instead it's aligning it to a TE screenshot. If you're just adding the information directly into TE rather than bubbling and scanning using letter codes instead of color codes. But I'll just say again, the same coordination with just looking at all these areas of CAEP outcomes reporting and pointing out exactly which check boxes correspond to these different categories and correspond to these different types of CAEP outcomes. Okay, I've done enough sanity checking, so I'm just going to jump out of outcomes into services. We also are recording short-term services. So here's the screenshot of what it looks like in TE. Again, we've got training services, transition services, and supportive services. Supportive services generally focus on the student's individual needs rather than the programmatic needs. So things like, personal counseling, legal counseling, childcare, transportation, that is services that work with the individual on their personal issues, with the idea that in order for a student to succeed in class, in order for a student to succeed on the job, they need to be whole personally. So if they've got personal issues that are getting in the way, those supportive services are looking at kind of working to improve those students' personal issues so they're a fuller person that has an easier time participating in instruction and other types of activities. Training services focus more on the programmatic issues, looking more directly to skills that a student might need to be better employed, or personal skills that allow them to look for jobs more easily, et cetera, et cetera. transition services are similar to training services, but they're more specifically focused on specific things you might do that allow a student to transition to the world of work and or transition to college. And then here's kind of a similar catch-all slide for services like we showed you for outcomes a few slides ago, looking at it, supportive transition and training services, and providing 3 or 4 examples in each one of those service categories. I'll just say, even in the best of times, you know, categorizing these services probably is a little bit closer to art than science. There really isn't a lot of good documentation that thoroughly gives you exact answers on this. So I'll admit that this is a little bit of, you know, there's a lot of gray area in between these categories. But if you're just needing some guidance, so you're marking it right and showing all those services you're providing, here's some here's some feedback to kind of help you figure out which category is best for each situation. Okay, so now I will sanity check, because you can see I even have an official transition slide here. I'll say I'll add we're doing pretty well in terms of time. We are kind of reaching the home stretch here. I'll just say, Anthony, we have all the way till 12, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so sanity check, everybody hanging in. Any questions? We actually, I think we're going to finish a little ahead based on this. All the remaining slides are kind of easy. Okay, so just some basic resources. Thanks, everybody's hanging in. All right, so basic resources. Here's our 2021-22 CAEP dictionary. Yes, we did update it. We tried to update it a bit and relay it to, related it more to these TE and TE Bubble Boy slides. So in the text of the data dictionary, it's easy to see which of those WIOA outcomes align to CAEP outcomes, and furthermore, which specific category of CAEP outcomes it falls under. So we really tried to connect the dots a little bit better this year in that CAEP data dictionary. We also have all those supporting attachments, summary of changes and so on. Another thing to bring up, this was new last year, not this year, but beginning in the 2021 year, we used that TE quarterly data submission. So everybody really ought to be using this by now, of course. But last year we started using that wizard. So big benefit number one is it includes your data and your data integrity report all together. Big bonus number two is it includes your WIOA 2 and your CAEP submission in one fell swoop. So when you do that quarterly reporting, oh, by the way, due date for first quarter, just a few days away. But as you do that reporting for the first quarter or any other quarter, you use that TE quarterly data submission wizard. And again, that includes your CAEP and your WIOA 2 data submission all together. Okay, E&E employment and earnings survey. So we've talked about this for a good year now, but everybody in all CAEP K-12s now do the employment and earnings survey. We have reprogrammed TE, so CAEP only agencies can access the E&E survey, just like WIOA 2 agencies can. The guidelines tend to vary depending on which quarter based on how a lot of those rules work. But bottom line is, I think the best thing to do is here's a link to all those help documents. They're separate documents depending on the reporting quarter. As an aside, if you're worried about this quarter, October 31, that would be the first quarter. So here's a link where you can download the TE help document if you're confused by some of those steps in that wizard. For data submission overall, here's our reporting calendar. Again, our due dates you can see over to the right. And then, oh, by the way, hint, hint, the first quarter due date, just 3 days from now, coming up here very soon. Okay, a little bit on remote testing. More and more, I've got to say, remote testing feels like so 2020 now. But I know some of you are still doing remote testing. So if that's an issue, if you're still doing most things remotely, Here's a link to the CASAS remote testing page. So for all things remote testing, including that agency remote testing agreement, here's where you can find out more information about that. Also, a little bit more on immigrant integration. This is starting to gain more traction, but these are those I3 outcomes. It's one of the categories on the CAEP summary. It's completely optional, but in response to AB 2098, you can now report measures for assessing effectiveness for immigrant integration. I got to say the gory details is kind of 25, 30 minutes we don't have, but trying to make a long story short is if you're doing those EL Civics COAPs, you can now parlay those scenarios when students pass EL Civics COAPs into I3 outcomes on your CAEP summary. That is, a student passes a COAP. What we've done over the last few years is align those EL Civics COAPs with immigrant integration AB 2098 outcomes. So whenever a student passes those EL Civics COAPs, it aligns to an immigrant integration goal area, and it now counts as an I3 outcome on your CAEP summary. That's, again, it was new last year, not this year. But if you haven't really had a chance to hear much about this, well, now you've heard about it. That's what we mean by those I3 outcomes. Okay, and now finishing up with the reports. So here's the CAEP summary. This is the one that is the most basic of all of them. I'll just say again, the real deep dive in reports was the previous presentation I did at 8:30. So I'll just say, if you want to kind of get in the weeds a little bit with some of these reports, look at the recording in the first hour. That's when we were looking at goal setting and stuff like that, and really digging into how to use the reports. So this one stays superficial. CASAS government. No, it's just the COAPs too. So yeah, the CIT, we don't have the CIT or the GNH aligned. It's just the COAPs. Sorry. I guess theoretically it might. I don't know. You can send me an email on that. We could maybe we could look at that, but for now it's only COAPs. And I'll just say again, there's a longer presentation I did a little bit last spring. I haven't done it in a while. I don't think any of the rest of us have done it. Right. They don't take COAPs. And so, yeah, it's just those COAPs that are aligned right now. It's not aligned to the CIT. That's just kind of the way it is. But a little bit of the research is the reason why we're able to use COAPs in this area is a group called Allies, which is right there in your backyard, Karen. So I'm sure you know who Allies is. They did a lot of research back about 5 to 10 years ago on immigrant integration. We at CASAS did a lot of research with Allies. Bottom line is that research was on COAPs. And between some research we did at CASAS with what they did at Allies, we found a lot of correlation. So we aligned those immigrant integration areas with the COAPs. So that's why we are saying when they pass COAPs, that counts as I3 immigrant integration indicators. There wasn't really that same alignment with the GNH or the citizenship. Okay, so anyway, back to the CAEP summary. So we've got those 3 areas, the left-hand side for literacy gains, the middle section for CAEP outcomes, the right-hand side for services, well, really the I3 outcomes are just from the COAPs that align to those I3 areas. So really when we're talking about past I3, we're really just talking about COAPs, but we're talking about those COAPs that relate to those I3 areas that Allies has developed. There really isn't any other way yet to get an integration indicator. What I will say is that committee that met a few years ago looking at AB 2098 did point out the obvious that, yeah, when students get, a library card or they get their driver's license or they do all those things, theoretically, that's I mean, I think most people would argue that's quite a bit more meaningful than just passing a COAP is on those kind of things. But because of verification and all that, and all the standardization issues, whenever that comes up in a state level discussion, it never quite gets universal buy-in, given the issue of, gee, how are we going to verify that students get their library card? How are we going to verify that students really and truly did get their driver's license? So those sort of things kind of get in the way a lot. I'll say, Portia, like we've talked about forever and ever when we're talking about documenting outcomes for EL Civics payment points. From that area, you know, probably getting your driver's license is a lot more meaningful than passing a COAP in that area too. But again, because of verification, the bottom line is passing a COAP gets the payment point, and actually getting those other more meaningful outcomes does not. CAEP outcomes, kind of the same logic there, I guess. Okay, CAEP DIR, kind of getting this going back to these reports a little bit. CAEP DIR, we've got those 27 data elements. Some of them are the usual suspects, you know, like demographics and 12 hours. We've got some in the middle that relate more to WIOA outcomes, some at the end that relate more to CAEP specific outcomes. But bottom line is it gives you these 27 data elements, gives you that item count and percentage for each of those elements. We've got those enrollees by hours. We talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the presentation. This is what we're suggesting for a lot of those new CAEP goal setting requirements. Again, looking at some of the columns and the CAEP summary, and then digging a little deeper and looking at the numbers of students in those 3 buckets. Again, looking at those with 12 or more hours versus those with 1 to 11 hours versus those with 0 hours. Okay, and then this is just blowing it up a little bit. Same thing I just said, just a blown up screenshot. Okay, and then here's the other one. And at the beginning, actually, I don't think I had the service enrollee by hours earlier. So here's a graphic of that second new report I was talking about, where the information is the same, but the display is kind of displayed inside out, where instead of looking at the number who show up in services and showing kind of how many have the different numbers of hours, here it's kind of looking at it inside out and reviewing those 3 buckets by services category. So it's digging a little bit deeper to say, okay, here's the number that have received supportive services, and of those, how many fall in each bucket. So if you've kind of looked at that first report and kind of figured out, yeah, we seem to have a lot of issues with some specific services only students, you can use the service enrollees by hours to get into a little bit more detail in terms of the specific types of services they received. So you can maybe sometimes address a little bit more the specific students that need to move into participant status or whatever. Okay, here's that past I3 outcome. Again, if you didn't really get that memo last year, that we're actively tracking those immigrant integration indicators. There it is. It's column F on the CAEP summary, just for proof in the pudding. Here's a couple of those I3 reports. You know, people are asking questions about it, so I'm glad I put these extra slides in here. This is the I3 summary. It's really, you know, very similar to what we're doing for EL Civics, but you can see the I3 summary looking at those immigrant integration areas, like what allies developed, you know, credentials and residency, digital literacy, the broad areas that are deemed to improve immigrant integration, and then looking at a summary of the COAPs attempted and passed in each of those I3 areas. Okay, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied on that. So we're going to move to the consortium level reports, a couple minutes, couple more slides. So here's a screenshot showing you the TE report menu option of where you can access consortium level reports in TE. Again, it gives you reports for all the agencies in the consortium rather than just one agency. This is intended for the consortium managers. Obviously, I know that's who a lot of you are. A lot of you probably have that access. So the good news is you can look at these reports and get data aggregated for the entire consortium rather than just one agency. The bad news is we do go out of our way to make sure you do not get drilled down right there. That is, you only get that at the agency level, given the obvious privacy issues and so on. But if you're a consortium manager, you can kind of compare and contrast data integrity report, CAEP summary, demographic summary, and so on, agency by agency. A lot of you at the consortium manager level have been saying, yeah, that's a priority. That's something we really want to try to do when we start doing these CAEP goal setting activities in NOVA and so on. So just to show, here's the consortium level demographic summary. It's giving you an item count and percent for each of those demographics areas. So just to show how it's working, it's giving you that agency ID, giving you the item count and percentage by agency. And then over in that kind of grayed out box, it's giving you the item count and percentage consortium wide. Here's barriers to employment and CAEP summary. Again, sometimes it gives you views where it will aggregate your whole consortium and give you consortium-wide numbers. That's what you would get if you click aggregate multiple agencies, or you can leave that unchecked, and that will still give you consortium-level information. But instead of aggregating it all on one report, it'll give multiple reports. That is a different page for each agency. Okay, and then that's it. Lots and lots of information crammed into an hour and a half, I admit. I don't understand. What do you mean, when is the date updated? Yeah, I don't understand that question at all. No, well, that's up to you. It's updated in TE, so that's 0% to do with us and 125% to do with you. I should be asking you that question. I don't know, have you entered all your data? If so, yes. If no, not. But yeah, that's 125% you question and a 0% me question. You tell me. Yeah, we don't do anything for this. It's all a matter of whether you and your fellow agencies in your consortium are doing a good job updating your data. If so, the answer is yes. Okay. Right. It's based on what you do, not based on what we do. Yeah, that's a good answer, Anne. Okay, I'm done. I'll keep monitoring questions. I'll let Anthony do his little spiel here.
Thanks, Jay. So what I'm going to do is I'm popping the link to the evaluation form in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes just to evaluate this session and actually all the sessions that you attend at the CAEP Summit, that'd be great. Presenters really appreciate the feedback that you provide. So please take a few minutes to do that. We'll see if any final questions come in here. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and close the session. Actually, let me stop the recording.